Welcome back to The Practical Woodsman. I'm Rut, the creator and host of The Practical Woodsman. That's right. It's my incredible genius which has brought this all into existence. Scientists and philosophers everywhere, studying my noggin, try to understand how it works and harness its powers. Appreciate you joining me for this episode of The Practical Woodsman podcast. The truth is, I'm very, very tired. It's a Friday night here, but I did want to get this episode out. Somebody asked me on the Practical Woodsman channel, said, I noticed that you are always using this floorless shelter. Can you talk more about that? And I said, that'd be a really good episode for the Practical Woodsman podcast. And so that's what we're going to do. I'm going to tell you all about floorless shelters, why they're the best, and why you might consider getting yourself one. And we're going to talk about tents and shelters in general. Before we do that, you know the routine. We got to do the musical introduction to get us all in the mood. Winkety winkety. So don't go nowhere. We'll be right here when that ends. That's right.
Put a camp up right here.
All right. Well, I ain't joking about being sleepy. I'm very tired, but with some of this old Kentucky bourbon here and just the interest of the topic at hand, I think I'll get my second wind as we go along. Floorless shelters. I'm going to cut to the chase right now and tell you the best part about a floorless shelter. Simplicity, superior experience. You get the most space for the least amount of pack weight and pack size possible. Greatest flexibility options. Most reliable in storms, wind, rain, snow. And they provide the greatest airflow, least amount of condensation of any shelter options out there. Before we really get into the meat and taters of this discussion, let me make a quick announcement. The Practical Woodsman online community is at thepracticalwoodsman.locals, LOCALS.com, or you can download the really spiffy locals.com app from the App Store and then just search for The Practical Woodsman once you get in there. I do exclusive live streams there on our group on Saturdays, which aren't completely exclusive anymore, because one thing I'm doing now is that I'm making the first half of the live stream available to you folks on YouTube and Rumble as well. But if you want to see the whole live stream, you're going to need to join our group there on Locals. And we have discussions and stuff throughout the week that are real fun about the woods and all those sorts of things. So consider joining us. Let's see, any other announcements? No, I think that's it. All right, I want to show you something. For those of you who are watching the video rather than just listening, I know some of you are out there just listening, and I'll make this, what am I trying to say? I will not record this forgetting that you folks are out there who are just listening. What I'm holding up here now in my hand to the camera is a one-person enclosed tent. This is a one-person enclosed tent. It feels like it weighs about 2.5, 3 pounds. All right? So that's a one-person enclosed tent. And if any of yous out there have ever slept in a one-person enclosed tent, you know that they're pretty cozy. And by cozy, what I mean is there ain't a whole lot of space inside of a one-person enclosed tent. Am I right or am I right? Or am I right? Right? So those of you watching the video can see this is not a small thing. This is not a small package. It's pretty big. You're going to have to tie that to the bottom of your backpack if you're going to take this one-person enclosed tent, and you're going to have to carry that weight, and you're going to have to deal with those tent poles and with the tent stakes, and you've got all this going on. That's a one-person enclosed tent. for all of this size and all that weight. All right, now, those of you watching should enjoy this. Here, what I'm holding up now to the camera, which is a fraction of the size of the one-person enclosed tent. It's a fraction of the size. It's the size of a football, American football. And this thing that I'm holding up that is the size of about an American football is a four-man tent. It weighs a fraction of this one-person enclosed tent. It's a fraction of the size of this one-person enclosed tent. A fraction of the size and the weight. And yet, this will comfortably sleep 4 grown men inside of it. Why is that? The reason is because it is a floorless teepee shelter. And so basically what you've got is you've just got material. And that material balls down to about the size of a football. And so in a nutshell, that is the reason why I love floorless shelters. Now I should say, I don't love just floorless shelters. It's not just the fact that they're floorless. That's not the one thing that makes me love them so much. I do love that they're floorless, but the other factor that makes me love a floorless shelter is also its form factor, meaning that you don't get a dome floorless shelter. All the floorless shelters that I'm familiar with and that I'm in love with all come in a either hexagon shape or they call them a teepee shape. Now there's something you should know about that teepee shape. The teepee shape offers the best headroom. It offers the very best real estate inside the shelter. It's the very strongest shape possible for weather. Even if you get like an enormous snow, which if it happens overnight and you're sleeping inside of the thing, could build up on your little tent and collapse your tent. You know, once the snow builds up and that weight builds up, it could actually collapse your tent, snap your tent poles right in two. That doesn't happen in a teepee or hexagon style shelter. The way that they're designed and made just makes them the strongest in all sorts of conditions. Looking again at this four-man tent, I mean, look at it. It's the size of an American football. It takes up no size, no space, hardly any weight. But you notice another beautiful thing about this? Now, I have tent stakes in there, but what else is missing from this that you would have to include in your tent? Tent poles, right? Right, I don't have to carry a tent pole, any tent poles with this thing. Now, if I'm carrying a hiking staff or a hiking stick, that can serve as my center pole, but I don't necessarily have to take it. You know why? Because I'm going into the woods. And what's there a whole lot of in the woods? A whole lot of sticks and downed trees and old branches and stuff lying on the forest floor. It's just it's an inherent part of the woods. A lot of times when I take these floorless shelters, I don't have to take any pole at all. No pole, no tent poles, because I know that it'll be so dirt simple for me to find a pole once I get out there that I then just cut the length, and then I've got my center pole for my teepee shelter. And so then my hands are freed up during the day. It's weight I don't have to carry. It's weight I don't have to worry about. And honestly, you know, if I set up camp somewhere and I use the center pole, I find some down tree or some down branch, and then I cut that to size. I use that as my center pole. When I head out the next morning, often I don't even take that with me. Because why? Because they're lying all over the place. I know that when I get to wherever I want to camp for that night, I'll find another one just as easily. So I don't have to carry that weight during the day. Now, this football size four-man shelter that I'm holding up here, this is called the Black Diamond Megalite. I don't even know if you can get them anymore. This one here is 16 years old, the one that I have, and it's still going strong. It's made out of sil nylon, and just last summer, I think it was, or last fall, I retreated the seams on this. So it's got a fresh seam work done on it. Let me pull that out there. You can see I used a really nice seam sealer on there. It's just almost like a rubber, turns into like rubber when it dries on those seams. And so I have been using this particular shelter here for years, and I love it. Used to take it a lot when I'd go with several other fellers, my brother being one of them, my buddy Jeff being another, because then we weren't all carrying our own shelters. I would carry that shelter because it takes up no space or weight, and so it was not a burden for me to carry it. And that meant that the other guys that went with us then didn't have to carry a shelter. 3 people in this 4-man shelter worked out just fine for us, and we could fit all of our gear in there, our backpacks and stuff like that. And it's a really nice shelter. Again, I don't know if you can get them anymore, but if you want to try, what I mean is I don't know if you can get them new anymore. I don't know if Black Diamond is still making them, but I love it so much that I would love to get a couple more and just keep them in stock. I mean, if they last 16 years, mine has, and it's still going strong. You can imagine if you get a couple and then just put them in stock and then only get them out when you wear one out. I mean, there's your shelter for life. What about a floor? What I use for my floors, so what I'm talking about is a ground tarp. What I use as a ground tarp for these floorless teepee style shelters is just any old thing I can find, usually. And I could go to Walmart, buy like an old blue tarp, and I just take the scissors on my Swiss Army knife, and I just cut that thing to about roughly the size of my body, you know, what I'm going to be lying on top of. And then I don't worry about flooring, you know, providing a ground tarp for the rest of the interior of the shelter. Because usually what I'm doing is I have an area inside my shelter where I have a ground tarp that's just about the size of my body. It's going to keep my mattress up off the ground. It's going to keep my blankets and stuff like that up off the ground. But then the whole rest of the interior of my floorless shelter is just workspace. It's workspace where I cook, I do work. I've even used that extra space in there for keeping firewood dry in a torrential downpour. And you know, I know that it's going to be soaking the firewood for the whole night or day that I'm there. I'll go out, cut up a bunch of firewood with my saw, and then I just store that firewood in my shelter with me to keep it up out of the rain, and therefore I have dry firewood for all the night and the next day. And you should be seeing some videos of me doing that. So back to the flooring or the ground tarp. I've used lots of things. I've used, just like I said, that old blue tarp that you get from Walmart, and then you just cut it down to the size that you want it to. This Tyvek, this Tyvek stuff that you can get off job sites and stuff works really well. Now they sell this, and for those of you who are just listening, I'm holding up it's a ground tarp that unfolds to twice my body width. But those watching on the camera or watching the video here can see that it's folded down to the size of a book, like a paperback book. It takes up no space or anything inside of my backpack, and this is what I use. This is what I've been using as the flooring inside of my floorless shelter. The ground tarp inside of my floorless shelter. Now they're selling these Tyvek things pre-cut now on Amazon, and it is that Tyvek material. But one of the positives about buying them pre-cut and marketed to Woodsman on Amazon is that they come grommeted. So those of you watching can see that what I'm holding up here is this Tyvek ground tarp, but it's grommeted. Why is that so nice? Because the thing might move around underneath of you when you're inside your shelter. Well, if you just take a few spare pegs or a few spare tent stakes, well, then you can just stake that into the ground the way you want it, and then it won't move all over creation underneath of you during the night. So those grommets are nice, and this Tyvek stuff is really nice because it just, like I say, it'll protect you from anything on the ground, but then when it comes to pack up, it packs down to like the size of a paperback book, and it weighs like less than a paperback book. So really nice ground tarps there. Another thing I want to show you is that Black Diamond Megalite. Let me get that again. This is the 4-man Black Diamond Megalite Sil Nylon teepee shelter that is about the size of an American football. And now I'm holding up another tent that I've been using lately. When I say lately, I mean like for the past 10 years. It's about the same size. This is only a 2-man floorless teepee shelter. And I've actually gone to preferring the 2-man, even though it packs down to about the same size as the 4-man, and it weighs about the same. And the reason for it is that if it's just me and my dog inside the shelter, the 4-person, I mean, it's spacious. It's very spacious inside of there. But this other one I'm holding up, which is about the same size, except what I mean is it's about the same size when it's packed down, about the same size and weight. It's not the same size when it's pitched. When it's pitched, will only fit about a 2-man interior along with their gear. But I kind of like that smaller, cozier space. And it comes with a couple of perks too. I think that this thing is a little bit better designed than the Black Diamond Megalite. There's some aspects to it that I just prefer better. And it still offers me plenty of space inside for cooking, moving around. You know, if I take like a backpacker's chair with me or something like that, you know, every once in a while you'll be around camp at night out in the middle of nowhere, and you'll feel a storm starting to hop up on you. Well, what a lot of the guys have to do, because they're living in tents, what a lot of those guys have to do is they have to actually break down their chairs, break down whatever they've been using around the fire so that they can get it in and get it out of the weather and keep it dry. I don't have to do that. Without breaking my chair down, I can bring it right into the shelter with me because I got tons of space in there. Another good thing about these floorless shelters, because they offer so much ample space on the inside, is that if I were out in the backcountry with some other guys and somebody else's tent fails, like let's say that happens, like on a wintry, snowy night out in the middle of the backcountry, and their tent fails in the middle of the night, high wind tears it to pieces, or an accumulation of snow collapses their tent in the middle of the night. Well, it's no sacrifice on my part to say, well, you come on over into my shelter because I've got lots of space. I can easily fit somebody else into my shelter if I have to. So a lot of benefits to that. Let me show you some of these other tents. You know, most people like carrying 2-person tents. So people who insist on having a tent, they often insist on having a 2-person tent. I know my friend Jeff does that. And you might be thinking about like the MSM Hubba Hubba tent. Is that what it's called? Yeah, it's a very popular tent. People rave about that tent. And this is that tent for all intents and purposes. Now, this is a generic version of that tent, but this is that exact same design that I'm holding up now to the camera, and you can see it's a monster. It's heavy. This is 4 or 5 pounds that I'm looking at. It's got the tent poles in there. It's got the tent stakes, got all that. got the rain fly, you got all that. And again, I just wanted to compare that to my 4-man Black Diamond Megalite. My 4-man Black Diamond Megalite, which is about the size of an American football in your hand when it's packed down, is a fraction of the size of this 2-man tent. Yet this 2-man tent does not provide not anywhere near the benefits that this 4-man teepee shelter offers. The trade-offs are, it's like a no-brainer. Now, so all those you watching the video can see the difference. You folks just listening, the significance is massive. We're talking about one of the most popular tents on the market, which is only a 2-person. You still don't get tons of headspace in something like that. But it's when it's packed down, it's enormous because you got to carry the tent poles. It's got a floor built into it, which is, by the way, is where most of the weight and the material on a tent comes from. It comes from its included floor. Compared here next to my 4-man, 4 grown men could fit into this football-sized little package I'm holding next to this really popular tent design that everybody out there and their sisters are using. So let's talk about this more. It's not my intention to tell you what to be using out in the woods. I don't care what you use out in the woods. My intention is to share with you the beautiful benefits of these floorless shelters, all of the benefits that come with it, and to possibly provoke you into questioning your motives for insisting on an enclosed tent. Here's what I had to say about this insistence on being fully enclosed in a shelter out in the woods. It's my strong, very, very strong belief that this does not come from rational, intellectual reasoning. This insistence that when I go out in the woods, I've got to be completely enclosed in my shelter. This is not a rational, intellectual conclusion that people reach. It's entirely emotional. It's entirely emotional. It's no different than when you were a kid believing that if you just hide your head underneath the blankets, the boogeyman can't get you. Is that rational? It's not rational. Boogeyman, there's nothing magical about those blankets that are going to keep the boogeyman from getting you underneath those blankets. And the same thing is like fear of the dark. If I can just keep a nightlight on, then scary things can't get me. I think if most of you listening and watching this can muster up within yourselves enough emotional and intellectual honesty when you ask yourself, really, what is the thing provoking me to want to be entirely enclosed in my shelter when I go hunting for a shelter, when I go shopping for a shelter? I think if you're being completely emotionally and intellectually honest about it with yourself, you will see that your reasons till now have been entirely emotional, not rational. Now, I can already predict that some of you will say, well, no, what about snakes? What about bugs? What about bears? What about yotes, coyotes? Are these not legitimate reasons for wanting to be fully enclosed in a tent? Maybe for 1 month out of the year. Now, let me tell you this. I have at times used fully enclosed tents. The last time I took a fully enclosed tent was back in, I'm going to guess, 2016. Now, I knew that the area where we were going had a big infestation of timber rattlesnakes. I also knew that the time of year we were going was about mating season for these timber rattlesnakes. And I had been out in that area before, and I'm telling you, they were everywhere, tripping all over these timber rattlesnakes. And in fact, I was there one fall when I had one. I thought the temperatures were way too cold for them to be out and be active, but one of them picked up the heat of my fire in the middle of the night and come out to find my fire. So that's the kind of area where I'm talking about. They were just everywhere, these timber rattlesnakes. And I knew they were going to be thick when we went out there. And so I did take a fully enclosed tent on that trip. That's the one time that and by the way, I was out in that same area many other times. One night, I was out there out in the middle of nowhere. And you know where I slept? I slept on a log. There was a log on the ground. I got there to that area in the woods, and I was just beat. I was dead tired. And I laid out on that log with the intention of getting up later and pitching my shelter and getting a fire going and everything like that. Never did. I fell asleep on that log. I slept the whole night through, right out in the open, right on that log, right there in, I'm telling you, thick timber rattlesnake territory. No harm come of it. So it was really in 2016 when I took that fully enclosed tent, it was really just as a precaution more than anything else. But most of the time when I'm taking a shelter out in the woods, I want my floorless shelter. My floorless shelter with a simple tarp cut to about my body size that I could throw down on the ground and keep up off the ground. Now, there might be some questions that folks have about these floorless shelters, like insects. Is the insect concern a real concern? It's not really. It's really not. Because the opening for these floorless shelters are at the ground. So there's about a 2-inch or maybe up to a 5-inch space between the ground and the bottom of these floorless shelters. Skeeters and bugs do not tend to fly under the tent. Now, if you're in there for a long time with like your headlamp on or something like that, and it's during that time of year where insects are thick, then of course you're gonna bring them into the shelter with you doing that. So what I say is don't do that. You go into the shelter at night when you're ready to go to sleep, or if the weather's just so foul that you get run in there. But otherwise, you don't get into your shelter with like your headlamp on or something like that. Leaving the door open especially, and expect you not to get insects in there. My friend Jeff, who insists on a fully enclosed tent for emotional reasons, like, I'll tell you what it's like. It's like Linus's security blanket in the Peanuts comic strip, or it's like, sucking your thumb, or it's any of these emotional comfort things, which make no sense whatsoever when you really stop and analyze them. But he insists on this completely enclosed tent year round, middle of December, temperatures 20 degrees below freezing, and he still insists on an enclosed tent. Why? What's going to get in there? Everything's hibernating. Nothing's going to get in there. You say, well, what about the wind that gets in there? Well, there's this thing, condensation. Condensation is the word. So all tents and all shelters are prone to condensation. How do you prevent condensation? With airflow. So anybody who thinks that they want to be completely enclosed in a tent or a shelter, they really don't know what they're talking about. Because if you're completely enclosed in your shelter, especially in the wintertime, but any time of year, you'll get rained on. What happens is your breathing creates condensation inside of the tent, and then that condensation forms on the inside of your tent or your shelter. And once that condensation gets heavy enough, well, then it starts to rain on you inside the tent or the shelter. Very rarely happens with these floorless teepee shelters because you've got plenty of airflow. And so condensation is never a thing that I really have to deal with in my floorless shelters because, like I say, at the bottom of the shelter, you have like 5 inches or less of space between the ground and the shelter. And so that offers plenty of airflow. There's also, on the door, I can zip down part way the top of my door on my floorless shelter. And so then I've got lots of airflow. And, so the idea that you don't want air passing through your shelter is ridiculous and false. People who know that airflow through your shelter is a good thing, not a bad thing. Now, what if it's 20 degrees below zero and it's windy out there, and you don't want the wind freezing you to death? Well, first of all, that little material of a shelter is really only designed to keep the gusts off of you, but it's not for insulation. Meaning, if you're thinking about your shelter as like a place where you're going to go in and get warm, like it's going to be warmer inside the shelter than it is outside the shelter, that's usually not true with these really thin shelters that we're using nowadays. There are exceptions. People build stove jacks into these floorless shelters, and then they bring in wood stoves. I'm not all about that, because that's camping. That's not real. That's not being out in the real woods. Nobody's carrying a wood stove who is in any true wilderness, because the things are just dadgum heavy. I mean, even if you get it down to just a couple pounds or something like that, you still have to take into consideration all the other things you have to take, which are layers of clothes, all of your food, and all of these other tools and stuff, your sleeping gear and stuff like that. I mean, space in a pack disappears awfully quick. So when I see these fake bushcraft videos of people like, oh, weight doesn't bother me, look at this, I'm going to take this 4-man shelter, it's made out of canvas, along with a wood stove out into the woods, and look how we're just living it real rough out here. No, you're not living it rough. You're 20 minutes from home. How do I know that? Because there's no way anybody who is traveling any real distance on foot is going to pack the stuff that you see in these videos. So really the answer to getting out into true wilderness and staying comfortable has nothing to do with packing along a wood stove. You're not going to do that. You're either going to do that and not be in true wilderness, or you're going to forego it, and then the possibility of getting out into true wilderness opens up to you. Anyway, I'm getting off on one of my tangents about these old stupid fake bushcraft videos out there that look great and everybody follows in the millions, based entirely on fiction. People shooting these videos in their backyards, and people love it. They really eat it up. But, my intended audience is people who want to know that they're being lied to and want to get a true sense of the true nature of what really being out in the wilderness is really like. There is no danger in a backyard, because if anything goes south, well, then you just hike up the hill to your house and you're saved. Piece of equipment or gear breaks on you, no big deal. You hike up the hill to your house. It doesn't matter if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, because it's your house. And you're saved. So it puts a hair in my biscuit to see these lies, these purposeful lies being reflected in these fake bushcraft videos, because when I'm out literally 40 miles from the nearest road, and I can't take something as fancy or as I can't take the things that will really sell a YouTube video, right? Like you don't want to see somebody cooking a potato out in the middle of the wilderness. What you want to see is somebody cooking some delicious, juicy steak with fresh butter and all these things, right? That's what sells the video. People just love that. But it's not real. It's not real. Now, if you're going to take the big steak and the fresh butter and stuff, all that, what does that mean you're not taking? Now, here's what I'm saying. I might be able to take big juicy steak and butter and a cast iron skillet out in 50 miles into the backcountry. But if I'm going to do that, it inherently means that I have to leave something else behind. Something else behind that might keep me alive, that might be the difference between life and death. But let's say that my interest is to make a really cool YouTube video. So I'm taking the steak and the cast iron skillet and everything, and then I'm leaving behind something else. Now my life's in danger because the dummies on the internet were making these videos that look great, but that do not reflect the true conditions of what it means to be out in the wilderness. So, boy, I could just go on, and I have for the past 2 years been griping about that same thing. So you guys have been following me for a while, probably might be getting tired of it, and then there might be others of you like, preach, brother, preach. What were we talking about? I don't remember what we were talking about. But getting out into true wilderness and being prepared for that anyway is my interest. Even if I'm not going to be out, 80 miles out in the backcountry, out in the middle of the wilderness, that's my mentality when I'm packing. It's got to be the least amount of weight, take up the least amount of space in my pack. It's got to be the best. It has to offer the best benefits for the least amount of weight, for the least amount of space in my pack. And you just can't beat these floorless shelters as far as practical use out there in the woods. Now, I think we were talking about insects getting in the shelter. Never happens to me. And I take these floorless shelters out in the backcountry all the time. Never happens to me. But I was in this area, and my friend took this. He insists on a completely enclosed tent. We get in the area, and he's working around his tent with his headlamp on. So he gets in his tent, got the door hanging wide open, got his headlamp on. What do you reckon happens? Tent fills up. I mean, fills up with flying insects and bugs and stuff, and moths and all sorts of things. And he is beating at that tent, trying to get him out of there for, talking like a solid hour. If you don't do silly things like that, then insects aren't going to be a problem. I've never had problems with insects inside my floorless teepee shelters. But, again, I don't turn on my headlamp, open up the door, get in the shelter, take my time getting the door shut and all that. I don't do that, and so insects don't get in there. What I do is if I'm getting in my shelter, I turn my headlamp off, completely off. I get inside the shelter. I make sure the door is completely closed, and then I turn my headlamp on if there's things I got to do inside the shelter. And that's only during the season where insects are a real issue, Like I'm saying, insects are not a real issue at night in fall, winter, early spring. It's not something you got to deal with. How about bears, coyotes, stuff like that? You worried about a bear coming up underneath your floorless shelter? Here's my thinking about that. If there's a situation where I need to hop up and get out of there, give me the floorless shelter every time, because I can just go right under it and get away if I have to. But if you're in a completely enclosed tent, you're just, you're a gas station burrito is what you are. And that fabric is not going to keep a bear out. It's not going to keep a pack of yotes out. So again, that goes back to this false sense of security, like Linus's security blanket, or sucking your thumb, or, the booger man can't get me if I've got a night light on, or if I'm hiding underneath the blankets. Completely irrational. These are emotional comforts. And the idea that you're safer in a completely enclosed tent from bears or yotes or anything like that, completely emotional, not rational at all. You're in a more dangerous position than I am in a floorless shelter, because in the floorless shelter, I just slip right up underneath the shelter and take off and I'm gone. Whereas you would be stuck inside your shelter. You'd be all tangled up in it, no way to get out, and the bear or the animal's just going to come right in at you. Another misconception that I hear an awful lot is people thinking that if it rains a lot, then water's just going to come up underneath your shelter. I don't know where these people are who are imagining it like that. Have you never pitched a tarp, just a standard tarp, and then watched it rain? The rain doesn't come up underneath the tarp, even if you've got the tarp pitched high. Not in the eastern woods. Now, I could see something like that happening like out in Arizona. I did some exploring out in the wilderness, like out in the Sedona area and stuff like that. And I can see that because of just the nature of the desert out there, how if you got a torrential downpour, that's where they get those flash floods and stuff like that. Well, I could see water pooling and then running in like streams up underneath your shelter out in those areas. But in the eastern woods, the ground just absorbs it right away. The water falls to the edge of your shelter, absorbs down into the ground. I never get any water under my shelter on my floorless teepee shelters. And it's interesting, in fact, that I've pitched my floorless teepee shelters in pouring rain before, and it has continued to just pour the rain for hours after I pitched my shelter. And within only an hour or so, the ground within my shelter is already drying, even though it's still pouring outside of my shelter. So all the ground around my shelter is getting completely soaked, while at the same time inside of my shelter, everything's drying. And I've witnessed that many, many times. We talked about condensation, right? So condensation is a real problem. It can even actually be a killer, because let's say that you're out in temperatures that are way below freezing, and you have all of your insulation there. You've got your sleeping bags, you've got your coats and your clothing and your layers and stuff like that. Well, if you don't have enough airflow through your shelter or your tent, and it starts to rain inside your shelter, that's what happens. The condensation builds up on the interior of your tent or your shelter, and it will either get so heavy that it will start to rain, literally rain inside your shelter, or every time you move around and you accidentally bump the side of your shelter, you cause the condensation to rain down on you. Well, now imagine that you've got like an $800 down, super fancy down sleeping bag, but it's getting soaked by the rain that you are creating inside of your shelter. Well, it's got to stay dry in order to insulate you and keep you from dying. So the fact that you're building up all that condensation inside your tent or your shelter is actually a danger to your life. So that never happens in my floorless shelters, because I've always got plenty of airflow. Air coming under that, the bottom 4 inches or so, 5 inches underneath the shelter, and taking all that condensation away, carrying it outside of the shelter. So I remain sheltered without having to deal with condensation and rain and getting my stuff wet. These floorless shelters, they give you typically a lot of headspace, a lot more headspace than you're going to get with like a tent that requires tent poles. Much stronger, hold up in weather amazingly, won't collapse under snow. We've talked about a lot of these things. I'm just kind of reiterating. I don't have to carry any tent poles. I don't have to carry a pole at all. And if I do want to carry a pole, it's just a hiking staff. So simplicity is just the king. But I wouldn't prefer simplicity if I got an inferior experience as a result of the simplicity. It just so happens that these floorless shelters provide the most simplicity and the overwhelmingly best benefits that you can hope to expect. If you think about you packing something like this 2-person hubba tent, MSR hubba tent, now imagine that in whatever backpack or whatever that you're packing this thing in, you could just take this out. You could just take this out. This big old enormous bulky thing. Now you're not carrying that weight. It's not taking up that space inside of your pack. What a relief that would be. What other things could you take in place of all this space and weight? Well, the options are limitless. There's lots of other things you could take. And that's the way I feel every time I pack my pack. Because I'm getting the very best shelter experience than anybody and it's at a fraction of the space and weight that everybody else is carrying. But, the thing that keeps people from doing it is this irrational, emotional comfort factor that we keep talking about. The idea of I'm not as secure if I'm not completely enclosed in. It's ridiculous. All the reasons that people have for wanting to be completely enclosed in their tent are emotional in nature, not rational. Now, let's talk for a second about just like a regular tarp. Here's what I learned. Here's what I figured out early on. I love tarps. I love the idea of just taking a tarp. The simplicity is nice. They offer a lot of different pitching styles and stuff like that. But what are some things that a tarp shelter requires? It requires a lot of cordage. Now imagine that it's storming outside and you want to throw up a tarp. Now it's true that you could throw up a simple lean-to or a simple Dorito style shelter real quick just by running a cord between two trees and throwing that thing over top the cordage, and there you go. But let's say that's a really bad storm and it's wintertime and you're talking about conditions where the wind is whipping all around and everything. Well, you're going to want to be enclosed. You're going to want to get out of that wind, and you're going to want your shelter to block that wind. The problem with a tarp is that in those conditions, it can take a long time. It's very complex. It creates a lot of complexity, meaning that you have to know how to tie certain knots. You have to know how to use your cordage and pitch your tarp to get just the type of pitch you want where you're enclosed on all sides as well as above your head. And that can take up to 20 minutes. No joke, it can even for people who are really experienced with these sorts of things. If you ever watch a video of different tarp pitches on YouTube or something like that, one thing you'll notice is that they never show you the whole process. They cut away. So they're going to say, okay, I'm going to show you this other tarp pitch. They don't just film them doing it. Why not? Because it takes so daggum long. And they have to stop and untie and retighten and move it this way and move it that way and make all of these adjustments. It takes them like 20, 30 minutes to do that, to get it just right so they're proud enough to show it to you on camera. Now imagine that these people are really good and really knowledgeable about pitching tarps, and not even they can do it in under 5 minutes. Not even they can do a complex pitch in like 5 minutes or so. In fact, it takes them so long that they have to cut the video away so that they don't lose your interest, because they've got to make all these adjustments over and over again. They get this pinned down, they walk over to the other side, they go, okay, that's not right. They have to undo that, redo it until they get it just right. So now imagine that you're in a foul weather situation and you've got a tarp with you. That's your shelter. Do you really want to spend 20 minutes standing out in the foulest of weather, messing with cordage and knots and adjustments until you get the thing just right? Of course you don't. And what I realized was that these floorless shelters, these floorless teepee style shelters, what you're getting is a tarp that is simply preformed into a certain shape. So you're getting all the benefits of a tarp, none of the drawbacks. They'll pitch everywhere, and it's simple every time. Last year when I was out on this excursion in the mountains, raining on us all day long. Well, when we got into camp, I pitched my shelter, and I had my shelter pitched in 2 minutes in the pouring rain, because there's nothing more complex to it than just simply staking the corners and shoving a pole up the middle, and voila, you got a dry space to get into. And you just cannot beat that simplicity. I love tarps, but you cannot beat the simplicity of a floorless shelter. There's nothing to struggle with. There's no knots or anything to struggle with. There's no cordage that you have to pitch between trees or in different, in different patterns or anything like that. It's the same thing every time. You throw it on the ground, stake the corners, pull up the middle, you're dry. You're in out of the weather. And you cannot beat that. You're not just in out of the weather, but you can do all of your work inside there. You've got plenty of space to do work, to organize your stuff, to get clothes out. You can even hang things inside a floorless shelter so that they can dry, even though the weather is terrible outside. So these regular tarps, they require a lot of complexity. Cordage, knots, special elaborate pitches can take a lot of time and energy to pitch it just right. But a floorless shelter is a tarp that's already in its final shape. Here's another thing about tarps. You see people pitching a tarp just like a lean-to, right? You even see like rain ponchos that double as a shelter, right? They look cute. This is another one of those things that you see on the internet and you think, wow, what a great concept. That looks great. What they call these pitches for these tarps a plow point. You've seen the plow point pitch, right? All of these things are great as long as the weather's good. Now think about that again. They're all great as long as the weather's good. Well, what's the purpose of a shelter? A purpose of a shelter is to protect you from weather that is not good. So take a look at that rain poncho again that they've pitched into a little lean-to shelter. What's going to happen if the weather, I'm not talking about a pitter-patter rain. I'm talking about real weather where it really starts to rain and the wind is moving around. That's what happens in foul weather. It rains and the wind is lashing about and moving things about, and a lot is happening all at once. Do you think that rain isn't going to come into the mouth of that thing and soak you even so? Of course. That is the deception that they're not telling you about with these plow point pitches and stuff and these little lean-tos made out of raincoats. It's fine if the weather's good, meaning if the worst weather you're getting is just some pitter-patters of rain, but the wind isn't moving, nothing else is happening. Fine. But can you count on, why? I don't want my shelter. I don't want any shelter. I don't want to mess with any shelter that is only good for just keeping a little dusting of light rain off of me. My shelter should be able to protect me from all sides and from the top. And that's what these floorless shelters do. It's a tarp, but it's not a tarp that's open on the sides. It's a tarp that encloses you completely. Well, from what I mean is from all sides. You've still got that opening down at the bottom, but it's protecting you from the gusts of wind. No rain is going to blow in there because when the wind blows, it blows up against the side of your teepee, right? And so you're protected on all sides from wind and weather. You're protected from the top, from wind and weather, rain, snow, whatever it is. And you're not carrying any extra weight than you would with a tarp. The complexity for pitching it is much more simple than it would be with a tarp. So you're getting all the benefits of just taking a tarp, but with these preformed shapes and stuff so that time and effort and stuff required for pitching is very, very minimal. So I hope that answers the question about why I insist on a floorless teepee style shelter. It's the best shelter that exists for the Woodsman. Hands down, best shelter that exists for the Woodsman. The benefits of them far outweigh any of the other types of shelters on the market, far outweigh the most expensive tents on the market. They're the very best for the Woodsman, hands down. There's nothing better that exists than the floorless teepee or hexagon style shelter. Other tents will collapse, they will rip, they will blow right off the ground and rip and tear and stuff, while the teepee style shelter will hold strong through all sorts of weather, provides all sorts of perks and benefits. It's the lightest, it's the most packable. You cannot beat the Floorless Teepee shelter design. It's the best that you can get. The only thing it requires from you is to get over some silly emotional issue or issues that has you believing that you're at some kind of advantage by being completely enclosed in a tent all around. You're not. It's not going to rob you of any comforts or anything like that by going with a floorless teepee shelter. So I'm afraid that when I watch this back later on, I'm going to say, boy, I could have done that a whole lot better, because I'm a little tired now on my second glass of hooch. But I think that for my intended audience, that is those of you with open minds, willing to hear some things maybe that are that you're not completely comfortable with up until now, that I think that you'll find value in this episode of the show. So it's Friday night, weekend's coming up. Y'all take care, have fun, but in a responsible, careful way. And I'll see you around here on The Practical Woodsman. Nice talking to you guys tonight. Y'all take care.